Now, Now, in today's class, we'll start off with second unit, and in the second unit, we'll cover all these topics that I've listed on the screen, right? So unit 2 includes consumer equilibrium, producer equilibrium, types of cost, and market structures, right? So after every topic, first of all, in every class, we'll do one topic, and then we'll do in the second half of the class, we'll do past paper questions related to that, right? So let's get started on this. So the first one that we'll talk about, the first topic that we'll talk about today is consumer equilibrium, right? Now, what is consumer equilibrium? As you will see in a bit, consumer equilibrium is a model that shows how consumers will allocate their spending between different goods. Now, think about this. You are a consumer, I'm a consumer, everyone in this world is a consumer because we have to buy some goods and services. Now, each one of us has limited income, right? And with limited income, we need to decide whether to buy good X or whether to buy good Y, whether to spend more money on education or on food or on what, right? So this model explains how consumers spend their money between different things. Model that explains consumers, model that explains consumer spending pattern, right? Easy. Okay, so that's what you need to know, right? Okay, now this being said, we will look at a graph, right? And through that graph, we will see that how consumers decide that which product to spend their money on, which product to spend more of their money on, and which product to spend less of their money on, right? Now, before we get started, there are certain assumptions, right? So let's quickly discuss those assumptions before we move forward, right? So assumptions are basically some things that we are assuming to be true, right? And this makes our lives easier because we already know what we are assuming, right? So assumptions of consumer equilibrium model, right? Now the first one is, right? So the first assumption is that obviously this is more than an assumption, this is a fact that consumers have limited income, right? I mean, whatever that income is, could be more or less, that's a different thing, but consumers have limited income. And as you can see for yourself or other people around you, that everyone has limited income from whatever source of income they're earning from, right? Then the second assumption that holds true is that product prices are fixed during certain time period, right? So whatever products you think about, their prices are staying constant, even though we know in real life, due to inflation, prices keep rising. But for now, we are assuming that during, we will change these assumptions as well in a bit, so you don't need to worry. Product prices are fixed during certain time period. Fixed during certain time period, right? Okay, then another assumption that you need to know that there are only two products that consumer can spend his income on, right? So we will again see how this turns out to be, but on a graph, we can't show more than two products, right? In real life, we know there are a couple of products that consumers are spending their money on, but for now, right, for the graph purposes, right, there are two products on which a consumer is spending their income on. There are only two products for consumer to consume, right? Easy. We good on this, students? Is everyone clear with these assumptions? Okay. Now, after this, let's get down to the graph and let's look at the graph for consumer equilibrium, which will clarify you more things. And then as we'll move forward, we'll see how we can edit this model to include, you know, other things as well, right? But first of all, we are looking at a very simple model of consumer equilibrium, right? Okay. Now, what's the first thing that you'll draw, right? So let's assume there are two products that a consumer wishes to spend his income on. One could be, let's say, you can take any two products, right? So let's say you have quantities of burgers on the y-axis and you have quantity of Coke, right? So these are, let's assume, two products that consumer wishes to spend his income on, right? And let's assume that the total income of this consumer is $200, right? So the total amount he has available to spend during this time period is $200. And let's assume that the price of each burger is $5, right? And the price of each, or let's say 10, right? So the price of each burger that he consumes is $10 and the price of each bottle of Coke is, let's say, $5. Easy, we got on this? Okay. Now, the first thing that you need to draw on consumer equilibrium graph, which we are about to look at right now, is budget line. What's the first thing that we are drawing on this graph, consumer equilibrium graph? It's the budget line, right? Now, as the word suggests, what is budget line? Budget line shows you how much can a consumer afford. How much can a consumer afford with available income, right? Now, let's assume that consumer wishes to spend all of his income on Coke. Let's assume consumer wishes to spend all of his income on Coke. How many units of Coke can this consumer buy if he spends all of his income on Coke? Right? So if a consumer spends all of his income on Coke, students, have a look at this. So 200 is the maximum amount that he can spend because that is his income. And if each bottle of Coke is worth $5, right? So 200 divided by 5 gives you how much? 40. So the maximum units of Coke this consumer can buy is 40 units. Students, are you following me? Right? So this point on the x-axis will be labeled as 40. Similarly, if consumer spends all of his income on buying burgers, right? So how many burgers could he buy? 20, right? 200 divided by 10 is 20, right? So you will write 20 over here. Now, all you have to do to construct the budget line, you just need to connect these two dots, and this is what your budget line is. Now, what this line shows us, that any point within the curve and on the curve is achievable, but any point outside the curve is not achievable, right? Just like production possibility curve. Any point within production possibility curve or on production possibility curve line is attainable by an economy. They can produce up till that point, but any point outside PPC, production possibility curve, is not achievable. You can't operate or produce over there, right? So this point, right? Whatever this point may be, right? So if this shows whatever quantity, right? So let's say this is showing you 10 units of Coke and let's say 12 units of burgers. So this is achievable with available amount of income, right? Similarly, this point is also achievable as long as it's within the curve. This point is also achievable. This is on the line, but any point outside budget line is not achievable because that is beyond your income level. Students, are you following me, right? So this is the idea. And then there's another difference. Think about this. Then there's another difference that you need to know, right? What's the difference between point B and point C? Now we can tell looking at the graph that B is within the curve and C is on the curve. So any point within the curve means you are not fully utilizing your income, right? So just like in the case of production possibility curve, students, do you guys remember or have you forgotten, right? So in case of production possibility curve, any line within PPC is obviously achievable, but that shows all resources are not fully utilized. So there are some unutilized or unemployed resources, but any point on the production possibility curve shows complete, complete utilization and complete employment of resources. So similarly, in the case of budget line as well, right? Any point within the curve means that some of your income is unspent, right? So you have saved some income, and any point on the line means that you have fully spent your income. Easy, we got on this. So that's the first thing that you need to know. And another thing that I want to tell you, that the objective of consumer, right? What's consumer objective? When you are spending something, right? What are we trying to get? We are trying to maximize our utility. What is utility? Utility is the satisfaction that we get from consumption. So our objective when we spend our money on anything, what is our objective? Our objective is to maximize our utility, maximize our satisfaction that we get out of that, right? Easy, students, right? So maximize utility. Okay. Therefore, if you want to maximize your utility, would you want to spend more income or less income? Students, think about this. How do we get utility? Utility is basically the satisfaction that we get from consuming something, right? When we buy food, that's consuming food. When we spend on other products like clothes, cars, shoes, laptops, accessories, right? So in each case, we are spending money on buying a product, right? Which give us some satisfaction, which has some use to it, right? Now, spending that money and using those products give us satisfaction, so we can get more utility if we spend more. So if we buy more goods and services, then obviously we'll get more utility. Students, are you following me? So therefore, consumer objective would be to spend all of his income, right? Not to save anything, but to spend all of his income, and therefore consumers would want to operate on production possibility curve and not within production possibility curve. How many of you are getting me, right? So to maximize their total utility, consumers would want to spend all of their income, and therefore they would operate on production possibility curve and not within production possibility curve. Easy? Is everyone clear on this? So that was the first thing, budget line. Now the second thing that we're about to look at, and let me show you on a separate graph, that's known as indifference curve. Now what's indifference curve, right? I'll show you in a bit and tell you what these are. Indifference curve shows, so you have again units of burgers on the y-axis, right? And you have units of Coke on x-axis. You could have taken any two products, right? Okay. Now these indifference curves are graph that shows consumer preferences between two things. Indifference curves graph shows consumer preferences between two products, right? Okay. Now have a look at this, students. So what you will do, what these graphs are, they are showing you preferences between these two products, burgers and Coke, and this indifference curve looks like this. It's a downward sloping curve which bends towards the origin. Downward sloping curve which bends towards the origin. This is what an indifference curve is, right? Now, what is this showing us? Let's take example, right? So let's choose few points on this indifference curve. Now, along one indifference curve, all points along one indifference curve, all points show you same level of utility, same level of satisfaction, right? So let's say at point A, you're consuming 15 units of Coke, right? And let's say 20 units of burgers, right? On let's say point B here, right? You are consuming, have a look at this, right? So on point B here, you can see that, let's say, a consumer is consuming 25 units of Coke and let's say 10 units of burgers, and on point C, consumer is consuming any other combination, right? So have a look at this, much more units of Coke, let's say 35 units of Coke and only 3 units of burgers. Okay, so let's take back. Now, these 3 points are lying on the same indifference curve. And what that means, that whether a consumer chooses A, or whether a consumer chooses bundle B, or whether a consumer chooses bundle C, all 3 bundles will give him same level of utility, same level of satisfaction, same level of utility. So the total utility, right? Let me write it down over here. So the total utility that consumer extracts from consuming either A, B, or C is same, right? Students, does it make sense, right? So all points along same indifference curve, all points on an indifference curve give consumers same level of utility, right? Indifference curve provide consumer same level of utility. Is everyone clear on this, right? So you are indifferent. That's why it's known as indifference. What does the word indifferent mean? Indifferent means that you're equally good. equally good. So if your friends ask you, should we go to McDonald's or should we go to KFC? And you say that I'm indifferent, this means that you're equally good. So you don't prefer KFC more over McDonald's, or McDonald's more, McDonald's less over KFC, or anything, right? So whether you go to KFC or McDonald's, you are equally happy between the two options, right? Similarly, if your friend says, should we go out for, for a movie, or should we go out to a cricket match? And you say that I'm indifferent, this means that you are equally good. So you neither prefer a movie over a cricket match, nor a cricket match over a movie. So you are equally happy between the two options, right? Okay, now this being said, so points on the same indifference curve, right? Points on the same indifference curve are providing that consumer same total utility. Easy. Any confusion? All points on indifference curve provide consumer same level of utility, right? Okay, but here's the thing. An indifference curve higher to another indifference curve, right? So if I make another indifference curve, which is to the right of this, now higher, further away from the origin, yeah, right? You can see that this pink one that I just made, right? Let's also label these curves, right? So this is I2, and this bottom one, let's say, is I1, right? Now, since I2 is higher than I1, right? It's further away from the origin. So on I2, a consumer will be able to achieve higher level of consumption, right? So if you choose points on, this I2, you will be able to see that on I2, consumer is consuming larger quantities of both the goods. Now, since consumer is consuming more quantities of both the goods at I2 compared to I1, therefore I2 will be preferred over I1. Students, are you following me? So since consumer is able to afford more units of the good on I2 compared to I1, so I2 is preferred over I1. Got it? Make sense? So any indifference curve to the right is preferred, right? So that's what you need to the right is preferred over another indifference curve, because it provides you larger consumption, more quantities of the two goods is preferred. Easy. We're going on this, students, right? Can we go back? Okay. Now let's draw some indifference curve on this graph, right? So this is the budget line that shows you how much you can afford. And then there's indifference curve that shows consumers' utility levels. That shows consumers, just a second, right? So that shows you consumers' utility levels, right? Now there will be a couple of indifference curve, and there's no limit to the indifference curve. Just like there's one budget line, unlike budget line, which could be only one, because budget line is showing you how much can you afford, right? I mean, it's always a challenge. Just a second, right? So let's say this is another indifference curve, then you can make another indifference curve on top of this, right? And all indifference curve, remember that they will be parallel to each other, right? They will not intersect. As you can see, I'm making these indifference curve, but all of these indifference curve are parallel. They're not touching each other, right? They're not intersecting each other, right? So that is how you need to draw. Okay. Now let's label all these different indifference curves. Let's say this is I1, this is 1, this is 2, right? This is 2, this is 3, the green one is 3, and the blue one is 4. Okay. Now, students, which of these 4 indifference curves would consumer prefer to operate on? Which of these 4 indifference curve would a consumer prefer to operate on? What do you think? Would a consumer want to operate on 1, 2, 3, or 4? Which curve would a consumer would prefer to operate on? Which is giving consumer highest level of utility? First, answer this question, as simple as that. Which of these consumer curves and indifference curves will give consumer the highest level of utility? Yeah, shouldn't be that difficult. I've just explained you. Which curve is giving consumer the highest level of utility? Yeah, no idea, right? So the one which is further away from the origin, the curve, the indifference curve, which is further away from the origin, which is to the rightmost, will give highest level of utility. Why? Because over there, you are consuming more quantities of goods and services. You are consuming larger quantities of goods, right? So as per that definition, it is indifference curve 4 that will be most preferred because that gives the consumer more quantities of goods, right? Yes, fourth curve, very nice. But here's the question. Another thing that needs to be that needs to be kept in mind is that how much can a consumer afford, right? So I mean, if I go out and ask people how much they want to consume, right? So they have endless wish lists, right? And like they want to consume as many goods and services, as many products as much they can, as much there could be, but there is a limit to how much they can afford, and that is known through the budget line. So therefore we need to see that which curve is obtainable, which curve is attainable within available income or available budget, right? Like 200, so second is best, exactly, right? Now just by looking at this diagram, very nice, Preet, right? So we can see that the fourth one is outside the budget line. I did tell you any point outside the budget line is not achievable. So fourth is gone. Similarly, indifference curve is also outside affordability because it's not touching the budget line. It's outside the budget line. So that's also removed. Now we are left with 1 and 2. Now 1 is achievable because you can see that it lies within the curve. 2 is also achievable, but only on this point. Indifference curve 2 is also achievable, but only on this point, not on other points, right? And why would consumer want to prefer on 2? Why would consumer prefer to operate on 2? Because 2 is higher than 1, which means that 2 will give you more satisfaction. It's further away from the origin, right? And 2 is higher than 1, so therefore 2 will be more desirable for the consumer compared to 1, right? So hence consumer will wish to operate on consumer will wish to operate on indifference curve 2, and this point will be known as consumer equilibrium point, where budget line and indifference curve are tangent to each other. This is known as consumer equilibrium point, right? And this point will show you how many units of Coke, will a consumer consume, and how many units of burgers will this consumer consume, right? So that's what this equilibrium point will show you, right? Higher utility. One will give lower satisfaction exactly because that was to the right of, that was to the left of indifference curve 2. So 2 is to the right of 1. Therefore, 2 will give higher level of satisfaction. Yes, that's correct. Easy. So this is consumer equilibrium point. And this entire model that we have just discussed is known as consumer equilibrium, which shows how many units of two products will a consumer consume, obviously with available amount of income, to maximize his utility, right? How many units of two goods, X and Y, right? Or Coke and burgers or whatever, will a consumer consume to maximize his total utility with available amount of income? That's what the model shows. Easy, we good on this? Students? Okay, but now,
could you please repeat what the indifference curve over here?
So indifference curve over here. So indifference curve overall, like general definition of indifference curve.
Yeah.
Okay. So indifference curve is a graph that shows points, right? Combination of two goods, right? Because there will always be 2 points, one on the y-axis, one on the x-axis. So indifference curve is a graph that shows combinations of two goods which yield same level of satisfaction to the consumer. Again, indifference curve is a graph that shows combinations. So A is showing you a combination of two products, B is showing you combination of two goods, C is showing you combination of two goods, right? Combination of two products, right? So indifference curve is a graph that shows combination, right, of two products which give same level of satisfaction to the consumer, right? However, if there's an indifference curve to the right of any other indifference curve, then that higher curve, which is to the right, will be preferred more. Why? Because that shows more quantities of goods, because that allows you to consume more quantities of goods. Easy? That's the idea, right? Okay, great. Now think about this. So coming back, this is your consumer equilibrium. Now, At this point, there is a mathematical formula that holds true. Now listen to this carefully, right? So this is again a new thing, right? So at this point of consumer equilibrium, there is this mathematical formula, which is known as equimarginal principle, which holds true. And what is that? Why is that important? This is what we are about to discuss. So this is known as equimarginal principle. So at the point of equilibrium or consumer equilibrium, this mathematical formula holds true, which is known as equimarginal principle. And that's the one that we are about to look at. Okay, have a look at this, students. Equimarginal principle. Marginal utility of A. I'll explain you what marginal utility of A is if you don't know, or let's take the name of the products that we're using over here. So let's say this is marginal utility of B. B stands for burgers, divided by price of B is equal to marginal utility of B divided by price of B is equal to marginal utility of Coke, which is C, marginal utility of Coke divided by price of Coke, right? So this is what your equimarginal principle says. Now let's try to understand this, that what this equimarginal principle is showing us, right? So first of all, let's understand what marginal utility is. Just like we know that there's marginal cost, there is, marginal revenue, there is this word marginal utility. So marginal means additional. You know this already, right? So the word marginal, wherever we use the word marginal in economics, that means additional. And what is utility? Utility is satisfaction. So by that standard, marginal utility would mean additional utility. Additional utility from consumption of one more unit of good. Additional utility or additional satisfaction due to consumption of utility. Second, utility from consumption of one more unit of good. Students, are you following me? Consumption of one more unit of good, right? So that's what marginal utility is. Okay. Now, the way we calculate marginal utility, have a look at this. There's a formula, right, that we use to calculate marginal utility. So that is calculated as change in total utility. So what is this delta? You must have seen this delta elsewhere as well. So this triangle sign that I've made, we use this in mathematics to show change. Change in total utility divided by change in consumption of X, right? Or that good X, right? So if you're calculating total utility of, let's say, burgers, right? So then it would be change in total utility divided by change in consumption or change in units of burgers, right? So change in burgers comes on the x-axis. Got it, students? So that is what marginal utility is. Additional utility from consumption of one more unit of good, right? Okay. Now, this being said, have a look at this. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of how this looks like, right? So we have unit 1, 2, let's say we are listing the units of burgers that a consumer consumes, right? So first unit of burger, second unit of burger, fourth unit of burger, fifth unit of burger, and so on and so forth, right? So the list keeps going forward. Okay. Now, after the first burger, right? So after the first burger, have a look at this. 1, 2, 3, right? 3. Then you have 4, and then you have 5. Okay, students. So when consumer consumes the first unit of burger, right? So let's say his total utility is 10, or let's say 20. After consuming the first burger, right? So units of that good, right? And then you have total utility on the total utility in the right column, right? Okay, so after consuming first unit, you have total of 20 units of utility. Then after consuming the second unit of burger, let's say the total utility is 35. Then you have, let's say 40, 2, then you have uh, then you have, let's say 46, and in the end you have, let's say 50. Okay, now students, this is making sense. What is difference between total and marginal utility? If you're still confused, please ask me. Total utility shows you how much is the total satisfaction after consuming a certain units of good, right? So when you ate first burger, you felt, right, you felt that you are, utility is basically an arbitrary value. It's not like weight, or it's not like height, which we can measure across people, right? So if I ask you how much is your height or how much is your weight, I mean, then we can compare your height or your weight or anyone's height or anyone's weight with someone else, right? Because I mean, the quantity is the same. So we can't compare utility in the same way, right? Because how much satisfaction do you get from consuming a Pizza Hut pizza is very different compared to another person, right? So we can't compare between people utility, but we can definitely ask you, ask one person that how much is the utility from consuming a certain thing, right? So if I say that whether you will like KFC, a burger of KFC or McDonald's, and if you say KFC, then it shows that your satisfaction or utility from consuming a KFC burger is higher than that of McDonald's, because that's why you chose KFC in the first place. Yes or no? Easy? Is it making sense? Different for every individual. Yes, right. That's correct, right? So these are your total utilities, right? So when you consume first burger, the total satisfaction you felt was 20 utils. When you consume the second burger, the total utility that you felt was 35. After the third one, 42, 46, and 50, and so on, right? Now, based on these values, we are about to calculate marginal utilities. Based on these values, we are about to calculate your marginal. Based on these values, we are about to calculate your marginal utilities. So to calculate marginal utilities, as I've just shown you the formula, you have to take the difference. So when you ate first burger, right? Yes, it will be, right? So when you ate first burger, right? So your utility increased from 0 to 20. So how much was your marginal utility for the first burger? Obviously 20, right? Because obviously when you're not consuming anything, your total utility is 0. And when you ate the first unit of first burger, your total utility increased to 20. So the marginal utility of first unit is 20 utils. After you consume the second burger, your marginal utility was 15. Why? Because 35 minus 20. 35 minus 20 is how much? 15. Then when you consume the third unit of the burger, right? Third burger. So your total utility rose from 35 to 42. So that means an additional 7, then 4, right? Then came in 4, and then came in again 4, right? So what are you seeing over here? That your marginal utility is diminishing. Exactly, very nice, right? So your marginal utility is diminishing, and that is true for all the products. As you keep consuming more units of the good, each additional unit gives you less satisfaction. Marginal utility always diminishes, right? Easy. Remember this, right? As you consume more units of any product, right? As you consume more units of any product, each additional unit gives you less satisfaction. Right? We good on this, students? Any confusion, anything that's not clear? Right? Okay. Now, this is what marginal utility is. Now, coming back to this equimarginal principle that we wrote over here, right? So what is this equimarginal principle? Let's look at this one more time. Equimarginal principle is a mathematical equation that shows what is true at the equilibrium point. Equimarginal principle is a mathematical formula that shows what holds true at this equilibrium point, at this consumer equilibrium point. And what is this showing us? It shows marginal utility of B divided by price of B is equals to marginal utility of C divided by price of C. Now, final point, right? Right. What is different? For given goods utility also decreases. Utility also decreases, Hassan. The only difference is that the consumption for the given good, the idea is different. I mean, when your incomes are decreasing, then you consume more units of those products. That's what given good is, right? I mean, it's not that their marginal utility doesn't diminish. It does diminish, but their relationship with the income is different. So otherwise, for other products, when your income decreases, you consume less of those products. But with given goods, when your income decreases, you consume more of those products because those are kind of inferior goods, right? Okay, so the class is about to end. Let me send you a link. So in fact, let's join with the same link and then we'll continue with this, right? Join.